Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Many of the episode topics on this podcast come from questioners, from listeners like you, in the parlance of National Public Radio. Some of the questions are pretty straightforward. Others are very large, and it's hard for me to wrap my mind around how to answer them effectively and succinctly. Doesn't mean the questions are bad. It just means I really have to work at it. Well, I have a question from listener Michael that goes along those lines. Let me just jump right in and give it to you. I'll tell you why this question is challenging to answer, and then I'll set up what the rest of this episode will be. Here's what he asks. Something I've been wondering about a lot is the social and historical construction of the Jewish people. Many Jewish and non-Jewish people assume that today's Jews are all descended from the ancient Hebrews, or at least all have their origins in the former Palestinian Mandate. I am wondering what evidence exists that this is true, and what some possible alternatives are. It seems to me that you can find Jewish people almost anywhere in the world, but that they resemble the culture ethnic group that they live alongside more than any Jewish reality. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to let me know. I'm Jewish myself and have struggled with this question when I did get the chance to visit Israel. Okay, Michael, that is a big question, and there are entire fields of history, Jewish studies, that attempt to answer this. There's not a unified theory. People are all over the map on this. What I'm going to try to do in this episode is to best explain what the different theories are, what is more mainstream, what's less mainstream, because even the question of where Jewish people come from is a heavily contested issue. And your point being that Jewish people in the world tend to resemble the culture ethnic group that they live alongside more than any Jewish reality gets into issues of 21st century integration and multiculturalism and assimilation. So what I think I'll try to do is to answer the first part of your question of what are the origins of the Jewish people? What does it even mean to be Jewish? And what are some competing definitions? Now, this episode will resemble one I did a couple of months ago about the origins of Islam by looking at its military history. It's always a little bit thornier looking into the early period of the foundation of a religion than it is on other historical topics, and you're also going to see the foundation of this period contested more hotly than other things. There really aren't that many people who get worked up about the origins of ancient Sumeria or Assyria, because there aren't necessarily a group of people that feel linked by identity or history to those people from thousands of years ago. That's true when we look at the origin of Islam. That's true when we look at the history of the Jewish people. But there's an additional challenge when we look at the history of the Jewish people, and that has to do with how we define Jewish identity. Now, Jewish personhood, depending on how it's been defined across the centuries, can have to do with theological and religious views, but it can also have to do with cultural and ethnic, genealogical, and personal dimensions as well. At least in the 21st century, the Orthodox Jewish and conservative Jewish definition deemed that a person is Jewish if their mother is Jewish or they underwent a conversion. But Reconstructionist Judaism and Reform Judaism accepts matrilineal and patrilineal descent. You can be born into Judaism. Now, this is different from many other world religions where simply converting to it and stating that you are that identity is sufficient to be a member of that religion. Islam is a little bit different. Anyone can become a Muslim if they repeat the Shahada, the statement of faith, and different interpretations of Sharia will say that if your father is a Muslim, then that means that you were born a Muslim as well. At least if we're talking about the legal aspects of Islam and inheritance rights and other things. But Judaism is different. Yes, it can have to do with theology, but it can also have to do with ethnicity on your matrilineal or patrilineal sides. And when you got into race science in the 19th century, people would think that there were racial dimensions associated with Judaism. This gets into the Nazi Party, where the Nazis were persecuting, rounding up, deporting, and committing genocide against Jews, and it had nothing to do with their theological beliefs. The Nazis didn't make suspected Jewish people pass a theological test and ask them what their thoughts were on theology and the character of God. They simply determined your ethnicity and what they thought to be racial characteristics. So this is something that's difficult and complicated. So what I will be doing in this episode is look at the competing views of the origins of Judaism, the diaspora that Michael talked about earlier, and what the identity of Jewish people are today. So that way you can at least understand the context of this question. Let's start out with the traditional view that is believed by Jews, but also by Christians, as well on the origins of the Jewish people. According to Jewish and Christian dogma, the Bible, or the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were all written by Moses around 1300 BC, which is at the tail end of the Bronze Age, after the exodus of the Jewish people out of Egypt. Now, a lot of more contemporary scholars have rejected this view because they would argue that the end of Deuteronomy describes Moses dying and being buried, so it would be hard for him to write it, and some even question if Moses ever existed. I'll get into more about the questions on the construction of the Bible and what different theories are there, but first let's just talk about the traditional understanding of where the Jewish people come from. So the origins of the Jewish faith and the Jewish people are explained throughout the Torah and referenced frequently, and according to them, God, after creation, reveals himself to a man named Abraham in the earlier parts of the Bronze Age, around 1900 BC or thereabouts, and he became known as the founder of Judaism. The belief is that God made a special covenant with Abraham: I will be your God, and you and your descendants will be my people, and his descendants were a chosen people who would create a great nation, and through this nation, that is how God would bless all nations. And then the story of the Jewish people is found throughout the New Testament as well, where Christians claim that this special blessing to the Jewish people is then extended to the Gentiles also, and Gentiles are non-Jewish people. The 3 patriarchs are Abraham, his son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob, and they're central figures as well in ancient Jewish history. Jacob takes the name Israel, from which Israelites come from, and his children and future generations are known as Israelites. And we have a huge jump in time that you can read about in the Old Testament of about 1,000 years, where the prophet Moses leads the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob out of Egypt, where they were slaves, and they had been slaves for hundreds of years, to the Promised Land, the land that was promised to Abraham and his descendants. And then God reveals his laws to Moses at Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments, and then later the entire Levitical law is revealed that has pretty extensive laws for the nation of Israel, how they are to conduct themselves, how they're to handle inheritance, how they are to handle dietary laws, how they should offer sacrifices to Yahweh in their temples, and all sorts of other laws that regulate habits and custom and aspects of daily life. The Jewish people conquered Israel, fighting the Canaanites and the Philistines. They established a monarchy in around 1000 BC. David rules the Jewish people. His son Solomon builds a first temple, and Jerusalem becomes a central place of worship for Jews. The kingdom then falls apart around 931 BC, and the 12 tribes of Israel are split into 2 groups, Israel in the north, 10 tribes, and Judah in the south with 2 tribes. Around the 8th century, the northern tribes are taken into exile by the Assyrians, and around 587, the Babylonians destroy the first temple and then puts Judah into exile. The destruction of the second temple was significant because Jewish people no longer had a place to gather and to offer sacrifices to Yahweh, and this is a central part of their religion, as you can see with all the laws about sacrifice in the Old Testament. Be like if Mecca and Medina were gone, and a tent pole of the Muslim religion is no longer able to be executed, and that's what it's like for the Jewish people. So at this point, the focus of worship shifts to local synagogues. Eventually, exiles return to Jerusalem. They rebuild Jerusalem for their Babylonian captivity. They rebuild the temple. And I'm going to skip over the Jewish diaspora now, but just mention some of the texts that are important in Judaism. So the Tanakh, which includes the Torah, is considered the sacred text of Judaism, but other manuscripts also became part of the canon. Around 200 AD, scholars compiled the Mishnah. It's a text that explains the Jewish code of law that was previously orally communicated. And after the expulsion of many Jewish people from Jerusalem by the Romans, Jewish worship becomes less geographically centered around a place, and it becomes more abstract. Later, the Talmud, which is a collection of teachings and commentaries on Jewish law, is created. It includes the Mishnah and another text known as the Gemara, which examines the Mishnah. It includes interpretation of rabbis and the importance of 613 commandments of Jewish law. The Talmud was finalized around the 3rd century, and the second form was completed around the 5th century. So the traditional Jewish view is that it is ethnic. It is descended from one person, and it is also a belief system. What's interesting is that outside critics recognize the Jewish people as a distinct group, but criticisms and alternative theories of the origins of the Jewish people go back all the way to the Roman Empire. Tacitus was a politician and historian of the Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries, and here's his theories on the origins of the Jewish people. He said the Jews are said to have been refugees from the island of Crete who settled in the remotest corner of Libya in the days when, according to the story, Saturn was driven from his throne by the aggression of Jupiter. A few authorities hold that in the reign of Isis, the surplus population of Egypt was evacuated to neighboring lands under the leadership of Hieronymus and Judas. Many assure us that the Jews are descended from those Ethiopians who were driven by fear and hatred to emigrate from their home country when Cepheus was king. Okay, so he's mentioning some different myths with Egyptian and Roman religious ideas. So he's going to give his own theory on where the Jewish people come from. What's interesting is that even though he challenges the traditional Jewish narrative, he accepts certain facts coming from the Jewish people's own history, that Moses was their leader, that they were established in Israel, and then he goes from there. So he takes certain facts at face value, but then radically reinterprets them. And I'll paraphrase this for a little while, but I think it's an interesting way that somebody in the ancient world is questioning the account of another religion. He says most authorities agree on the following account. Egypt was once plagued by a wasting disease which caused bodily disfigurement. So it's almost like he's accepting the story of the 10 plagues. So the Pharaoh went to the oracle to ask for a cure and was told to purify his kingdom by expelling the victims to other lands as they lay under a divine curse. Thus a multitude of sufferers was rounded up, herded together and abandoned in the wilderness. Here the exiles tearfully resign themselves to their fate. But one of them, who is called Moses, urges companions not to wait passively for help from God or man, for both had deserted them. They should trust their own initiative and to whatever guidance first helped them to extricate themselves from their present plight. They agreed and started off at random into the unknown, but exhaustion set in, chiefly through lack of water, and the level plain was already strewn with the bodies of those who had collapsed and were at their last gasp, when a herd of wild donkeys left their pasture and made for the spade of a wooded crag. Moses followed them and was able to bring to light a number of abundant channels of water, whose presence he had deduced from a grassy patch of ground. This relieved their thirst. They traveled on for 6 days without a break, and on the 7th they expelled the previous inhabitants of Canaan, took over their lands, and in them built a holy city and temple. Now, Tacitus does not like the Jewish people from this account, obviously. He's saying that they were a diseased people and that's why they were kicked out of Egypt. But then Tacitus seems to take some parts of the Exodus story, such as that the Jewish people were all expelled, that Moses did exist, that they were starving, that they found water, much in the way that the Exodus story is that Moses strikes a rock with his staff and then water springs forth, and that they take over the land of Canaan. Then he says that Moses prescribed for them a novel religion different from those of the rest of mankind. Among the Jews, he says, all things are profane that we hold sacred. On the other hand, they regard as permissible what seems to us immoral. In the innermost part of the temple, they consecrated an image of the animal which had delivered them from their wandering and thirst, choosing a ram as beast of sacrifice to demonstrate, so it seems, their contempt for Haman. They avoid eating pork in memory of their tribulations, and they themselves were once infected with the disease to which this creature is subject. They still fast frequently as an admission of the hunger they endured so long, and to symbolize their hurried meal, the bread is eaten by the Jews is unleavened. We are told the 7th day was set aside for rest, because this marked the end of their toils. In the course of time, the seductions of idleness made them devote every 7th year to indolence as well. Others say that this is a mark of respect to Saturn, either because they owe the basic principles of their religion to Idei, who, we are told, were expelled in the company of Saturn and became the founders of the Jewish race, or because, among the 7 stars that rule mankind, the one that describes the highest orbit and exerts the greatest influence is Saturn. The Egyptians worship a variety of animals in half-human, half-bestial forms, whereas the Jewish religion is a purely spiritual monotheism. They hold it to be impious to make idols of perishable materials